Hello all, welcome to and welcome back to my page. Today I wanted to go into a bit more of a specific video on what changes happened when I moved, and specifically splitting my orchid collection in half and starting with the Paphiopedilums for today, and just some general topics on the water, light, temperature, and humidity. Overall, my Paphiopedilums, the Paphs, fared extremely well in the transport process. During the repotting phase that I went through when I got here to check the roots, I noticed that many of the roots appeared somewhat dry while I was checking them, but still had a hard substance, which was a bit strange. So I was really uncertain, so I ended up potting everything back up. With regard to the repots and some of them just being put back in the same media, I did make sure that this time around all my paths had a bit of sphagnum moss in the pots because of the drastic change in humidity here in the desert. Now, moving along to watering. Watering was something that changed drastically for me. The tap water here is super hard, and in my previous video and now, I still haven't purchased a ppm meter, but nothing has changed. The Paphiopedilums were the orchids whose roots handled it better than all my other orchids. Mainly the Paphs is primarily the other orchid that I do have, but the Paphs for sure handled this quite well. One of the challenges actually were the pots because of the mineral buildup. And I do know that Paphs do have sensitive roots, so the mineral buildup over time probably would have caused me quite a bit of a problem. So with my Paphs, I do use about a 50-50 or maybe even 70-30. Anyway, I do mix my tap water with a bit of distilled water so I can decrease my flushing frequency, because as you can see in the desert here, or as you can imagine or know, in the desert we don't have a lot of water, so I don't have the option of collecting rainwater. And although water is cheap, it does build up when you have more than 100 plants. But anyway, with regard to my Paphs, I do water about once a week during what I know is the grow season here. Now that I have central AC, my apartment basically stays a pretty good ambient temperature of a range of maybe 73 to 80 degrees, but primarily 77 degrees is what I keep my apartment at, and that dry time for the Paphs is about 1 week. Now, in the grow area that I do have set up, the humidity is pretty good with my humidifier running, especially after watering day. My humidity does maintain an ambient percentage of about 50 to 60% with the humidifier running. Without the humidifier, about 30 to 40. My humidifier runs about 8 hours, give or take, if it's not too clogged. The water here does clog it. So my humidifier runs about 6 hours really on the medium tempo or medium setting that I have it on. It runs for about 6 hours. If I have on the low setting, it runs for about 8. And on the highest setting, it only runs for about 4 hours. However, with the hard water here, it slows down the machine, so I can always tell if my humidifier is taking way too long to run out. It's time for a cleaning. Now also, moving along to one of the other factors, light. Now, I do also sustain my light in tandem with my humidity. Now, I do say sustain. I couldn't think of the word to use, but my lights are controlled and my humidity is controlled. So my lights, I'm a bit OCD about them, so they're timed on whatever the sunrise and the sunset in the Philippines are, so that during the summertime, I know when to give them about 14, maybe I bump it out to 15 hours of light, but in the winter I make sure it never goes below 12. So when I first moved here, I put the orchids in front of my balcony window, which is north facing, and I thought, oh, in the desert, I'm gonna have great light, even though I have a north facing balcony. And I was wrong. Most of my paths became extremely slow when I knew them to be quite intermediate growers because of the conditions that you can cultivate under grow lights from when I was in DC. So I quickly moved them to the grow light setup. And one more thing to mention about when you grow in a north window or in an area that is primarily shade, the watering completely changes because the plants aren't photosynthesizing, so they aren't drinking the water in the pot. So my watering schedules for all of my plants were off because my paphs were primarily in bark with a little moss, and my phals were in bark but with more moss. And you'll see with the phals later, I completely changed them to moss, but with the paphs, again, I did add moss to all of my paphs, even though they were primarily bark, because the humidity here makes the water evaporate out of the pot extremely fast. Like, it's really insane. And in tandem with the humidity and the light, the temperature here, again, is intermediate. So my highs are around 80, my lows around 73, but I do keep my apartment while I'm home around 75, 77. And these temperatures are basically a natural variance because let's say I don't run the AC, it's gonna get that high and low with the natural change of the day and night. Now, here in the desert, I found that to be not so true. So the nighttime temperature and the daytime temperatures aren't that different normally. However, I am out here during a particularly rainy season, and I have very cool nights and high humidity in the evenings. Very similar to where I was in DC, but this is an anomaly out here, so I'm pretty lucky and I'm taking advantage of it. Now, I did only move here again in June, so I'm uncertain of really the progress of my plants. I do have a couple of plants and orchids out on my balcony, and I watch them meticulously every day. But yes, those are the things I've noticed, and I do know that fall here starts basically in November, which is when our temperatures start to drop, and that's almost a month and a half late from where I was before on the East Coast. Now, I want to go into some miscellaneous things that I've learned about my collection. And one thing about Paphiopedilums that I loved is that the bottom of a lot of the leaves are purple. And my calatheas that I purchased, aka prayer plants, the bottom of their leaves are also purple. And from watching care videos on them, I learned that the purple undersides actually help the plant to reflect more light back into the leaf from the underside. So basically the light goes through the plant on the green and actually is reflected back on the red purple back into the leaf, which allows them to essentially, cope in extremely low light because they can do a lot with the light. So I thought that was a pretty cool thing to mention if you grow paphs, which are my favorite orchids, and you just find out all these cool things about them, which make them your favoriteest orchids. And lastly, the other thing that I switched to was I no longer fertilize my collection with liquid fertilizers or with powders. I now use slow release fertilizers in all my pots because one of the things I known about fertilizers is that the plant will primarily feed when it is warm. They won't feed when they don't need to, when it's cooler. And because it's always warm here, the fertilizer, slow release fertilizer that I use only release when it's warm. So they will only release when the plant needs it. And with my collection growing, I really hope this works. It seems to be working so far. I really just add the fertilizer into the under layer of the top layer of my mixes, which is something that I took from Miss Orchid Girl online. So basically, as I'm potting, right before I put the top layer, I put slow release fertilizer right under that. And my top layer of most of my plants is bark, even if there's soil or moss under them. Now moving along, I do have some specific examples that I did want to get into about some changes and some updates about some plants. And one of the changes that I really do want to warn you or set off an alarm, because this is something that I always heard, but I got to ignore because my humidity was good, and that is with small pots. So here I have my Wardii, my Favor Long Miracle, which is a cross of Henryanum and Leucochilum, and my species Appletonianum. And these three paths I water maybe twice a week because the pots are so small. Moving along, these plants I have in bloom. So two paths, which also happen to be both Leucochilum crosses. So I have my QF Acala Lalo, which is Delenatii by Leucochilum, and I have my QF Winona, which is Nivium by Leucochilum, or either which way they are. These are both in blooms. I love Paphiopedilum, Paphiopedilums. I was talking to a friend of mine on Instagram, and we both kind of don't like white paths, but they do it for me because they're small and they're the only plants that I can place around my house and they won't die quick from something like bud blast. So with these breakies, like I like to call them for short, a lot of times with the hybrids I'm seeing, they will bloom at least twice a year, and sometimes you can put them in your bathroom or on a desk, a coffee table, and they're really handy because they're tiny and don't take up any type of space. Moving along, I have my cat Brioe, which I think I looked up online. I think that's how you pronounce it, Catherine Brioe. She's also a cross of Delenatii and Leucochilum, but she has a different name because back in the day, Leucochilum was Godefroy variation Leucochilum, and at that time, the cross with the Delenatii was named Cat Brioe. So I do have that putting on new growth, as well as my dog Goldie, which is a cross between Rothschildianum and Arminiacum. That is such a weird one to say to me. I just want to say Americans. But anyway, it's a yellow plant crossed with the king of paths, the Roth. And that's also putting on new growth. Haven't seen that bloom yet. And my Richardianum here is putting on some new growth. This one hasn't bloomed for me in 2 years, but at the same time, I lost the growth in the back, but it's putting on 2 new growths in the front. And also, speaking of new growths, I do have my Ho Chi Minh, which is putting on a new growth on one of the segments, but this did split for me while I was doing a repot. So I now have 2 Ho Chi Minhs, even though it's still just one plant. So I'm hoping that they bloom at the same time when they do bloom, because that would be pretty cool. And lastly, on the struggle bus is my species Micranthum. My Micranthum I repotted in a self-watering pot. Well, it's a small self-watering pot, has a tiny reservoir at the bottom because I don't want it to ever go dry, but at the same time, I don't water it often. So I noticed that it took well to the self-watering pot, but it never took well to me over-watering it. So I'm testing in that, leaving it there. I have it under a couple of plants so that it only gets shaded light. And that's where I'm wrapping it up with you guys for today. So please give this video a like and subscribe to my page because I do give updates. I may move on to some of my houseplants, but I don't know, my collection's not too extensive. My orchids are all doing well. I don't have a lot that require too much of a bounce back right now, if they're in a bounce back, and the rest are just not bouncing back. They're just growing and enjoying this new setup in the corner that I have for them. So if you want to follow my journey again on other social media platforms, I do go by The Right Path, like my name here. So on Instagram and Facebook, TheRightPaphs. Bye guys, and I'll see you in the next video.